thank you everyone for coming to our first ever DIGI debate. Tonight we are going to be debating the motion "This House believes that Gen Z will change the world," which is a kind of deliberately facetious and fairly provocative title. But the aim of it is to kind of encourage a bit of interesting and kind of balanced and fair debate and hear some different sides of the argument that have maybe not been given the same kind of mainstream cultural narrative. So thank you so much to our sponsors, Soho House, for your investment in the evening. Thank you so much to the speakers. I just wanted to briefly introduce Digi Fairy, because a question we get asked quite a lot of the time is, what the fuck is a digital fairy? We are a creative studio and consultancy, and we provide a range of kind of creative and consultancy services for brands across the fashion, lifestyle, and kind of youth market audience. And the reason that we wanted to do tonight was because we've just released a trend report that looks into Gen Z and kind of does a bit of myth busting. So that kind of has facilitated the discussion this evening. I am Livy Gallop, and I run something called Fairy Futures, which is our strategy and trend reporting division of the business. So before I start, the idea for Digi Debate started because we had been to a fair few panel discussions where I think they'd been great, the quality of the speakers have been fantastic and the topics have been fantastic, but with a panel format you don't necessarily always get people who disagree with each other, and that can end up being a kind of a bit of an echo chamber and end up leading to people just kind of echoing other people, and you leave the evening feeling, I've maybe not seen such a balanced or kind of nuanced debate as I could have seen. So what we're doing here is really to kind of do a debate as a rhetorical construct that enables us to really dig deep into an issue. It allows us to kind of play the devil's advocate, and it also allows us to get under the skin of what the issue is. So it goes without saying that because this debate is a rhetorical construct, people here the speakers have been invited to speak either for or against. So what they're about to say doesn't necessarily represent the views of themselves or their organisation. It's just for the good of the debate. The way that tonight is going to work is we will start the debate by having speakers from each side read a kind of prepared speech that they've brought along with them tonight. We're then going to open it up so that each side can criticise and kind of unpack what the others have said. And following that discussion, we will then open it up to questions from you guys, where you get the chance to quiz and grill these guys. And then we'll end it with a vote to see whether the motion will kind of carry or whether the motion will fall. So before we get into it, I actually just want to ask you to raise your hand first if you believe that the motion carries and that and that Gen Z will change the world. You just stick your hands up while we have some. Okay, interesting. Do we have a fairy helper to count those up? Shout when keep those up so that we can. Okay, there's someone at the back who really firmly believes that Gen Z are going to change the world. Fab. Okay, cool. And hands down. And then can you put your hand up if you are a Gen Z cynic and you think that they will not change the world? Ooh, come on, be proud. Stick them up. Okay, cool. You got that? Yeah, cool. Okay, fab. So thank you for doing that. I'd like to introduce the panel tonight. So speaking for the motion on my right-hand side, that was the hard part, I was going to get that bit wrong. We have first Jack from Depop. If you don't know Depop, it's a Gen Z platform that's kind of a cross between an eBay and an Instagram, and it operates on the same kind of mechanics, and it's really, really popular with Gen Z. Really popular. And then our second speaker for the motion is Chloe Combi, who is a futurist and author of the kind of seminal work on Gen Z, which is Their Voices, Their Lives. And speaking against the motion, our devil's advocates are firstly Frankie from Foundation FM. She founded Foundation FM. It's a female-led radio station, and it has a lot of kind of millennial and Gen Z listeners, and Frankie herself is a millennial, so we'll be hearing a kind of counterpoint from her. And then secondly, we have Zoe, who's a Gen Z, who is a freelance filmmaker, journalist, Girlgaze ambassador, and contributor to our Gen Z report. The list goes on. Really excited to have them speaking tonight. The media has said a lot of kind of whack things about Gen Z, and I kind of pulled out some of them on a bit of a Wikipedia hole last night. So before we get in, I just want to read some things. So Time magazine says, Gen Z demand change. The Independent is screaming that they are the new face of financial power, while Gucci's Trying for Change says that the future is fluid. ID magazine accused Gen Z of killing the musical genre, citing Billie Eilish. So I don't know if there's any like music execs in there, but you might want to store that up for a question later. Whilst CNBC, reputable media source, says that they are the loneliest generation. But my favourite report, my favourite kind of claim about them was Gen Z will have a seismic impact on the cheese market in years to come. So that's some food for thought. Okay, perfect. So let's get going. Jack, do you want to take the floor and give us your first...
Hello. It doesn't take a lot to see that the potential of Gen Z is huge. They're the first generation to grow up with the internet and hyperconnectivity at their fingerprints, which means they're also the first generation to grow up with sustainability, inclusivity, and lots of social problems at their fingertips too. There's a load of angles I could take to show you how Gen Z are already shaping the world as we see it, ranging from environmentalism, challenging social norms, and inclusivity. But I actually just want to highlight a few examples in terms of their consumption habits, how they're changing those to meet the needs of the planet. First of all, the number of Gen Zs practicing veganism and vegetarianism is much higher than millennials and any previous generation. They consume over 60% more tofu and plant-based foods, but the average person that's a Gen Z is 5 times more likely to be using non-dairy alternatives as well. So these choices are basically made because they have access to social media. They can see that this is really damaging to the planet and animal welfare. On a similar note, if you take a look at fashion, it's the second most polluting industry in the world after oil. Pinterest have recently reported that there's a 50% increase in sustainable fashion brands year on year, and that's driven by millennials and Gen Z. So they've been equipped with this knowledge that their choices on the high street aren't good for the planet, and that's likely to affect the world they live on. So 79% of Gen Zers have said they consider the environment before they choose to purchase something. It means that they're driving a huge amount of growth in second-hand fashion, which is the kind of industry/area that I work in. And the market for that is currently over 350 billion. So it's huge. Some of the sectors, such as luxury fashion, it's actually projected that second-hand's actually going to overtake first-hand fashion by 2022. So they're really driving these markets. So ultimately, you can't really deny that they're not going to change the world because they already are. Like, we have natural resources are depleting. The population of the world is expected to get to 9 billion by 2050. Like, Gen Z have access to all that. They can see the damage it's causing. So they're making these choices in their lifestyles, which actually, like, ultimately are probably going to become less choices and more actually necessities. So it's, like, really great that they've already taken the first step and started to do that. There you go.
Thank you very much. Chloe, would you like to follow up with your secondary argument?
Thank you, Jack. The first thing I'd like to say is that Generation Z are economic geniuses. Social media, Instagram, YouTube, vlogging, TikTok, is often promoted by the media as these sort of vain constructs that kind of cultivate self-loathing. But in fact, Generation Z is a generation that feel quite excluded by traditional jobs in the economy. So they've created this alternative, very lucrative economy that's inhabited and driven entirely by them, excludes older people, and it's a place where they can make money. So it's this very, very successful alternative economy that's been kind of sort of semi-created and driven by Generation Z. So it's a real economic evolution and survival, and it's admirable. They're the first generation that creates the media that they consume. So with previous generations, there was media gatekeepers. There was the Simon Cowells, there was the Anna Wintours, and they told you what to buy, what to wear, what to look like, what to love, and they sold that thing and they created all the fashions. Generation Z have fired them and they've created their own media, you know, their Instagram, their YouTube, and they've made the stars, they make the fashions, they make the trends. And that's made them incredibly powerful. And it's making them able to completely recreate their world in their own image. Consider the female body and female beauty as an example. For decades now, because the media has been created by these kind of rich, distant people who told everyone what to buy and what to love and what to look like, we've had this incredibly monolithic standard of beauty, which has been tall, white and thin. But now, because Generation Z are kind of creating Instagram, and Instagram's a driver of the media, we're now having this incredibly diverse sort of representation of beauty. We're seeing women of colour, plus-size women, trans women, women with tattoos, alternative beauty. You know, this smorgasbord of representation. And there's immediate brilliant benefits. This is the first 5 years where anorexia has plummeted in 12 to 16-year-old girls because there isn't this kind of deification of this thin... you know, tall, thin girl, that girls suddenly don't want to look like that because they can see this normality and this diversity and representation, and that's really powerful. And previous generations, decades of generations, when women have said, does my bum look big in this? It's been sort of motivated by self-loathing, but Generation Z want to be told, yes, your bum looks massive. Yes. The LGBTQI experience, it's not perfect yet, but this is the first generation of teenagers that if you come out, you're not going to be isolated or alienated or alone. You can be celebrated. And obviously, the arc of change takes a long time, but it's incredible the improvement that LGBTQI kids are going to have from even 5 or 10 years ago. It's extraordinary, and you see this improvement, and that's really, really fueled by Generation Z. And I think that's going to be carried forward by them so that, you know, LGBTQI kids aren't bullied and they aren't alone and isolated. And already we're seeing a decline in depression and self-harming and suicide amongst that group who were previously very vulnerable and had these, you know, very high rates of those things. And finally, Generation Z is a generation that will not suffer in silence. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, trans rights, employment rights. These things are, you know, they're incredibly important. They're propagated. They're discussed on social media. And if you are someone who bullies or exploits or is a perv, you can't get away with it anymore. Because those rights are sort of discussed and centralised by Generation Z, and you can't be silenced because going back to that thing that they have a voice, they control their own media, and they can kind of expose those issues online. So I think there's many more things, but this is Generation Z who are kinder, who are fairer, and there's going to be more of a kind of a generational equality, and there's going to be a better world, not just for the very, very kind of, you know, elite few, but for everybody, and that's a really good thing.
Cool, thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause? Thank you for the foresight. Thanks so much, guys. And now it's your turn. Frankie, take it away. Why are Gen Z not going to change the world?
Because I'm not a millennial like me. No, I've written something, don't worry. I feel like these days, and it's not new, that we are obsessed with youth. I think we even fetishize it. I was really nervous to say that word. If we look at YouTubers, Instagram, they're all really, really, really young. And it kind of goes back to that like X Factor thing. If you look at radio stations as well, most of them aim themselves at 15 to 18-year-olds. And it's that X Factor thing of that everyone on that show is really young. The younger, the better. You're going to get more out of them. And if you're over 25, which is not old, you are kind of lumped in this group called the 25ers and overs. And then Sharon and Louis are like, no one wants you. And everyone gets in a fight about it. And you're kind of told that you aren't marketable and you're not valid and you don't have a voice and you have no value, which I think is really sad. And so messages are flooded to younger people and Gen Z about what they should like and they should buy, and that is controlled by older people that aren't Generation Z. So I feel like online there are so many messages of what to like, how to look, what to be, how to be different, who's going to follow you, and how many followers they should have. I actually work with a lot of Gen Zers, and I think the pressures are really, really real. Every generation has had pressure, but I don't think they've had it on a platform like this before. Not only do you have to get like good grades, you also have to like make a Zine, and then you have to get into university, and then you have to get good grades there, and then you have to get a job, but it's not going to pay you that well. And I really wouldn't feel like saving the world after that. I'd be like, no, we're okay. We're tired. So I think we kind of need to put the power back into other voices. I think we need a bit of a revolution, come with me, and a revelation that past a certain age, you still are really valuable and you are very much valid. So I think we should have a blog or a podcast from older women about, you know, the menopause. Like, where are those blogs? Because I'm a woman, that's going to happen to me. I know zero facts about that. And if that was there, that's going to change my world. And I think that's really important. I want a YouTuber that was part of Windrush. Like, I want to know more information about that. I want a radio show from someone who's in grassroots radio, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think I got that right. And I think that will change so many people's worlds if we hear from voices that aren't just from the youth. I feel like if we forget the past, we are doomed to repeat it. And if Gen Z can't save us, why don't we, you know, recruit the older generations and give them voices and listen to them? I feel like Gen Z are also really down with the trends and what's hot and what's not. And I feel like activism is really cool right now. But what happens when that stops being cool? A couple of examples of this is like, if you look like at the trend of Michael Dapper, where is he now? You know, the NSG options dance, like who's doing that now? And one thing about activism is, I'll say, is like Jamie Windust is an amazing non-binary activist and is the editor of Fruitcake magazine. And they have 28,000 followers and their petition's been running for months now. They have not got 28,000 signatures. They just have all these posts that are liked, but are people taking action around that? I think everyone can raise awareness and we can all post online, but how proactive are we being in that? I don't want anyone, anyway, to feel the pressure of saving the world just falls on one generation and on their shoulders. I think it's something that we can each empower another person to do. So they don't have to save the world, we can all do it. But they won't anyway, so.
Cool, thanks. And Zoe?
Yeah, hi. So I think that with every generation there's good and there is bad. We were in a time where we're making changes and making progress, but there's still age-old problems. Racism still exists, xenophobia still exists, if not more rife than ever. Social media activism, it's so easy to just post about an issue that you're passionate about. And it's almost like when you post something or when you change your profile picture with a filter that's supporting something, you're almost perceived online as an activist and that you're making a difference and you're progressive. But if you're not donating to campaigns, if you're not out on the streets actually doing grassroots, that's the one, activism, you're not really creating that much of a change. And although like social media campaigns spread awareness, do they really create government change? Do they really impact our politicians? And also, I think that the media have a good way of shaping Gen Z to focus on all these young activists that are working towards climate change, but not questioning government as to, well, why are you not doing anything about it? There's all these great young people that are spreading awareness and fighting the fight, but we're not seeing any change from the place that we need it in. I also think it's interesting when you look at online activism as a person of colour, when you say something about, you know, you were going down the street and someone said something about you and you post about that online. I've been called an activist and I'm like, well, you know what? I never chose to be an activist. I'm just fighting for my identity. I'm just existing online, talking about my life. But that's seen as activism. Although I know that if a white friend of mine was talking about how they walked down the street, nothing would have happened. They wouldn't have been an activist. They would have just been sharing their life online. And there's a good quote from Rowan Blanchard, who is a American activist and actress who's Gen Z. And she wrote, Activism has become a trend. My identity isn't a trend, however. Who gets to decide who becomes an activist and who just has to be one because they're forced to fight for themselves as a minority? I think Gen Z have been hyped up in the media as radical change makers, and the whole climate change argument is really progressive and welcoming. However, I don't believe it's creating real change in politics. Instagram is a great way of connection. I know personally that I have connected online and found a community online, but I also know that I have been given a new way to be criticised. This rise of social media is great. It's connecting people, but it's also creating great polarisation in our media. I know that I follow people with the same views as me, and whenever I'm scrolling through Twitter or Instagram, I'm seeing great women of colour who are doing amazing things, and I often become a bit complacent in the way I exist in the world and how much I give out into the world, and I think, yeah, everything's fine, our generation is great, we've all got the same views, we've all got the same values. But if I followed young Tories, or if I followed women that I don't connect with, or men that I don't agree with, or right-wing politicians, I would be a lot more aware of the problems in the world, if that makes sense. I think as well with social media, it's great to see diversity. It's great to see more women of colour, but that's almost becoming a fetishization of ourselves, because, yeah, women want to look like women of colour. This is why blackfishing has become such a big problem, is because women of colour, the way we look is now seen as desirable. So now everyone wants to jump on that, despite the years and centuries of being a person of colour and the way you look being criticised and being persecuted for it. I also think with mental health, I find a lot of strength for my mental health through social media and seeing brilliant people really create inspirational artwork and start a really good conversation and destigmatize the problems. But we still have a fear of certain types of mental health issues, and we don't talk about them. I don't dare I say it, but it's almost become kind of trendy to be depressed or be anxious online, because in a way you're almost attention seeking. And I'm not criticizing the people that have done it, but I do think that there's people with bipolar disorder and there's people with schizophrenia, and they're not welcomed online in the same way people with depression and anxiety are. And I'm not pitting mental health issues against each other. I'm just saying that if we've really destigmatized the problem, then we wouldn't have this discourse. I also think that from my own mental health, I found a lot of triggering content online, and it's very hard to talk about mental health in a way that's, that's spreading a message and starting a conversation, but also protecting people that suffer from mental health issues and can see triggering posts online. We don't have the filtering like that. I still see content online that I find triggering, so I know that the filters are not working as well as they should. But yeah, that's all my thoughts.
Thank you so much, and a round of applause for those. Cool. Was there anything immediately that you guys wanted to pick up on out of those?
A couple
arguments.
of things.
Yeah. Cool.
I think I always say that history doesn't repeat itself, because it can't, but it rhymes, and I would agree. And I've been researching. I've been all over Europe, and I've sort of interviewed about 10,000 of Generation Z, both online and offline, and sort of being across Europe. And this has been going on for about 6 years. And I would completely agree in the first sort of flush of that, in about sort of 2013 and 2014, I think that there was that quite millennial-tinged desire towards this kind of clicktivism, hashtagging, signing a petition and thinking that was enough to institute change. And then crisis hit. We had Brexit. We had Trump. We had kind of growing sort of polarisation, political polarisation, rising extremism. We suddenly had, the critical crisis that is, the sort of climate. We had all these social issues. We have falling apart sort of social networks. We've got all the kind of social problems we have. And I think in the same, and so when I first started looking at Generation Z, I think there was this quite 1950s, quite conservative, attached to the home, attached to the phone, and obviously the differentiation was technology. I think about 2000, when 2016 hit, people, and particularly young people, realised that it wasn't enough to sign petition. They had to get boots on the ground. And what you're actually seeing now is a growing trend across Europe for not complaining online or tweeting about things or Instagramming about things, but actually going to marches and demonstrations. And we saw across Europe these school walkouts over climate change. And these weren't tiny, these were really big. And what you're seeing is a conversation in lots of countries, including this country, where people are actually, and young people are actually saying that they realise that it's not enough to be active online, they have to be physically active. And I think the biggest rising conversation is, what can I actively do? What can I actually get involved in to institute this change? And I absolutely guarantee over the next 3 years, you're going to see that rising and rising. And I think in the same way that you saw the levy break, and like if you look at the 70s with the Vietnam War and the kind of Watergate and all the things that were happening over here, you saw it in the 90s with the poll tax rights. If you look through history, that young people, they get pushed. I think that there is a point where they suddenly say, actually, it isn't enough to just be cross about this. And you see this kind of explosion of activism, and I think we've reached that point with young people, and it's quite exciting. It's scary and exciting, and I think that's happening and kicking off.
Thanks. Did you guys have anything you wanted to question these guys on?
I mean, I think that's really exciting. I could completely agree. One thing I wanted to pick up on, it kind of ties in when we were talking about, like, they are demanding something different and they're out there being active. And when you were saying that, like, with fashion, we're looking more at sustainability. But I think Gen Z aren't in the main fashion houses. And if there are, like, fashion houses choosing to be sustainable, that's not a Gen Z's choice. That's the fashion house, who probably is a bit older. That's their responsibility to change it. So, yeah, they might be demanding some things, but the power still lies in another area, another place, another generation. So I feel like you can't take that and make it like a Gen Z claim. It might be someone else's. But, yeah.
I kind of have something to say in response to that.
You might.
Here we go.
I
actually really agree with you, is that when you go to the high street and you see...
Hang on.
Stay in your lane.
Debate. It's cool.
These places are, like, pretty much driven by, like, senior figures, but actually you're seeing a lot less young people shopping on the high street.
Yeah.
It's like Topshop have just posted pretty terrible figures. ASOS, haven't been doing that well. And that's because, like, Gen Z are becoming this really powerful spending force. So they're actually looking at alternatives, and, like, whilst sustainability might be like a very, like, airy-fairy thing on, like, H&M are actually very good, but on Topshop's, like, radar, it's like
I think it will become increasingly demanding.
Yeah.
I think that respond to that demand is and it is really interesting that when you start when you start to see, and I've talked to loads of brands, that one of the things I think Gen Z, and it's an amazing thing, is that they increasingly look to brands for moral compasses, and they look to brands to kind of represent their kind of their ethical makeup. So you're actually seeing brands making ethical choices because they know that it's going to kind of create kind of an alignment, and they have to sometimes make a choice that they're going to make an ethical choice or fall on the side of a kind of an ethical line. So, for example, you saw with Nike, with the Colin Kaepernick thing, and they realised that they were going to alienate a certain kind of, a white Republican male, but they realised that sacrificing that particular demographic was worth it for the statement it made to an audience and a consumer that they wanted more, and it made them loads of money. So they're not stupid. They know that these choices, but one of the really interesting powers about Generation Z, because whether or not it's online ethics like hashtag veganism or something they really believe in is almost irrelevant. But what it is actually doing is, because people want brands to represent their ethical makeup and what they stand for, that increasingly, whether it's real or not, it's actually driving brands to behave better and behave more ethically and believe more ethically. So it's almost sometimes when you talk to brands, it's almost like when they say, well, do Generation Z really, really believe in this? And it's like, well, probably the majority of them do. But even if it's performative ethics, that you do it because it looks good on Instagram, if it actually drives conglomerate huge brands to be better and do better, then that's a really, really good thing. And you're sort of seeing this, that because of the pressure of and the weight of the pressure, and because of the influence of kind of their presence on Instagram and on social media, that brands are incredibly responsive to these ethical demands of these new consumers, and I think that you're going to just see more and more better consumer behaviour, and also you're actually seeing brands that are striving to represent those consumers as well. So the biggest mistakes that brands make is when they are trying to appeal to a generation they don't understand. So again, we're sort of seeing inclusivity, ethics, and kind of ethical behaviour that's obviously both performative and real, but it's ultimately going to result in a much better world, and that's really Gen Z driven. Sorry, that was a really long-winded thing.
I'd like to kind of throw my hat into the ring unless you've got something to...
I'm just going to say one more thing.
Please come back on that.
Oh my God, I didn't realise I was going to be so talkative. I was going to say that looking at Topshop's figures, I think the kind of like... I don't want to say demise because they're still around, but there was a bit of a shift and change when the feminists don't wear pink debacle happened, which is where they had a pop-up in Topshop. Philip Green demanded to take it down, and there was a campaign, hashtag feminists wear pink, not green, and that massively impacted how people looked at Topshop. Scarlett, who runs that, and with a few other friends, including Honey and Grace, they are not Gen Z. Gina Martin, who pushed through the upskirting bill, she is not Gen Z. And Monroe Bergdorf, who works with a lot of brands, is not Gen Z. And so I feel like millennials as well, if we're going to talk about sustainability, activism, they're a massive part of it. Like, I know a lot of the brands that I work with and the influencers I look to, they're not Gen Z. And I think it's important to have that, because I don't think I would look at like a 17-year-old and relate in the same way I do as someone in their 20s, just because that's who I am, that's my age range, and they've gone through similar experiences to me and they're talking to me. I think it's important that every age we have that. And it's also important for teenagers to have someone to look up to. Like, I know that my 16-year-old cousin, who was like, yeah, Topshop, love it so much, I wear it at school all the time. The, feminists wear pink, not green happened. Has she gone in Topshop since? No, and it's important to have those voices to look up to. And so I think millennials are very much relevant in this change.
Yeah, I think you're picking up on a kind of broader cultural problem around the like cottage industry of like generational analysis, which is that it's fundamentally very, very difficult to separate out the boundaries between generations are very blurry. There's a kind of continuation argument, like the Pew Center, which is this like massive research agency in the US, published a thing saying Gen Z actually look a lot like millennials when it comes to key social and political issues. They kind of vote broadly the same. A lot of the movements have been, as you're right, like founded and led by millennials, and that what Gen Z is doing is the kind of continuation of a like broader wave of cultural social justice that's been like introduced by previous generations. Yeah.
I agree.
Thanks. I have something else I would like to challenge you guys on, if that's all right. I have problems. I struggle with assigning kind of specifics and characteristics to Gen Z that can broadly be said to be true of youth culture in general. So, like, throughout time, every youth cohort through the kind of 20th century thinks they are more liberal than previous generations. They think they are more activist than previous generations. Every kind of young person wants to change the world. And whether or not those values like stick around, it kind of remains to be said. Like, it's kind of broadly true that people become more, at least like financially conservative the older they get, certainly in like Western capitalist societies. So what do you think about that? The kind of the challenge that maybe a lot of the things people are saying about Gen Z are actually just broader youth cultural characteristics.
I'm going to let Jack. I think it's a lazy argument, and the reason is because just because it's done before It doesn't devalue it. And I think it's often used as a strategy to disempower sort of the movement forward of Generation Z, and you often sort of see it in quite kind of conservative right-wing presses, kind of sneering snowflakes, you know, on their phones. And the point is that argument has been made by older generations towards every generation, whether it's from the 50s onwards. And if they'd listened to them, then there never would have been any social progress. So I think that absolutely, it's not nothing happens in a vacuum. And it's almost impossible to do something that's totally new or individual or fresh. But having said that, I think that the things that motivate it are new to this generation. And if they listen to the fact, well, this is unoriginal behaviour, then we'll never have any social progress. So I think it's a defunct, obsolete argument, really.
Thanks. Cool. No, I just exist to kind of stir the pot, basically. So
do you agree?
I also think, like, when you think about that whole thing of, like, as people get older, they become more right-wing because of they need
Have
the
more
money
money.
more.
That is obviously a lazy
actually
generalisation, but yeah.
If you look at, like, young people are staying with their parents, you were saying earlier, like, young people are staying with their parents for longer, they're choosing experiences over possessions. Like, I think you might find that actually, whilst I'm sure inevitably as they have, like, children, even though they're having less, that kind of, like, right-wingism will come through, that they're going to have a much longer time being able to be activists because they have, in an odd way, like, this shelter of, like, their parents' home, or they have less real responsibility. It kind of gives them more of a platform to actually be active and be vocal about what they care about and do things there. I don't know if that kind of, like, is...
Any thoughts?
I think it's interesting. I don't know if you guys know of the girl on Twitter who, she's a young Tory, she's very pretty. What's her face?
Yeah, I know.
Exactly. It's this whole
Someone
thing,
Google.
like, she's so cool, but she's also a Tory. Like, how diverse? But it's like, I don't want to put my political
That's actually
opinion.
the right wing in youth is actually massively growing.
Yeah.
The extreme right wing.
There is. I think there is. While there is great people fighting for change and fighting for equality, there is a lot of young right wing people as well. Like, as any generation, there's always going to be people with different opinions. I don't know if necessarily the left wing is greater than, or...
I think also it's the growth of social media. You feel like you can put your opinion out there more, and so you can be a bit more extreme and hide behind a screen. Like, trolling is a very aggressive form, and it comes with those, you know, on social media, and it is prevalent in younger people because they're online, they're on their phones, they're seeing, like, arguments, they're seeing videos, they're seeing, like, really heavy things. So your opinions are going to be quite extreme. And I feel like with what we've seen in the last couple of years, especially, like, on talk shows, on, you know, in call-ins, that when you have an argument for the left, you have a very extreme left and you have a very extreme right, like almost to the point that we kind of say, oh, if you're going to be arguing for, you know, trans rights, you have to have someone that's, you know, transphobic. And we're kind of making those opinions okay because we're seeing them more and more online. We're seeing them more and more on television, which for me doesn't sit right.
Yeah, so this has now become very, like, meta-textual because we're now talking about the debate itself and whether or not having this debate is a good idea. So hang in there. Cool. I have another, like, controversial thing to chuck in. I have a back of the napkin theory that maybe the reason why we are like celebrating Gen Z so much and hailing them as, like, the saviors of the planet and all that kind of guff is because we scapegoated millennials so hard. Millennials had a really rough time. If you Google millennials are killing, you get about 3 million results claiming that millennials are killing off XYZ. We know the avocados thing. We have some posters up around the hall, around, like, through the bar, where you can just vote. So go and do that afterwards. But it appears that a lot of people here tonight are millennials. So I feel like
I think that the flip side of it is that millennials were kind of the guinea pigs of many things. They were kind of the guinea pigs of social media. They were the guinea pigs of the smartphone revolution. They were caught in the crossfire between obviously the economic crash when houses became much, much more expensive. And in a sense, I think that one of the real benefits Generation Z is they've been able to benefit from the mistakes and the pain of millennials. So, for example, wholesale millennials threw themselves into screen life, and reflectively Generation Z perhaps realise that screens can be damaging and there's a value in limiting your screen time. And actually, I think that that's another point of why that they can change the world, because poor millennials, they acted as the kind of, that they were the guinea pigs in the example that Generation Z can learn from, but it's good in a way they can pass on the lessons learned and their wisdom so that they don't make the mistakes millennials make, so they can extrapolate the benefits of things like kind of social media or current politics or the media, the media, or learning on all the things we're doing, and perhaps leave behind some of the more damaging behaviours. So in a sense that they kind of like steal the thunder of millennials, and they don't suffer the same consequences that happen to millennials.
Yeah, interesting. I feel like it will be interesting to see, and obviously we can't answer this tonight, but it will be interesting to see what will happen when Gen Z mature and we now become obsessed with like Gen Alpha, which is the people who are like screaming babies right now, because maybe, as we saw with millennials, there's this massive cultural hype at the moment, like Gen Z are like nothing you've ever seen before, partly because the people who are telling you that have a like vested business interest in that being so. Once we move beyond Gen Z and focus on Gen Alpha, will the hype for Gen Z changing the world die down? I don't know.
Well, it's like it'd be really interesting. The whole thing about FOMO and the new emerging things. So fear of missing out. And one of the big buzzwords is JOMO, with joy of missing out, and the whole thing about sort of putting down your screens and re-engaging with the world. And that's kind of obviously a big growing thing is the Nokia and flip phone. It'd be really interesting to see if that cultivates and grows a lot with Generation Z.
I think it's slightly a different point, but I think what's interesting is, this fetishization of being young. I know I often, I think my existential crisis is, do I get asked things because I'm a freelance filmmaker or journalist, or do I get asked things because I'm a freelance filmmaker and journalist and I'm only 20? And I think it's this thing of, is it because I'm young and doing things, or is it because what I'm doing's actually important?
Yeah, that's a really good point to make, and I'm sorry for introducing you primarily as a Gen Z. I hold up my hands. Cool. I have some questions for you guys, if that's all right, or do you have anything you want to keep challenging them on? No? You happy to? Okay, I wanted to float the hustle culture thing with you guys and say that this is actually something that Jack can maybe then jump on the back of, and just make the kind of pro Gen Z changing the world claim that Gen Z are being hyped as being super, super entrepreneurial. They participate in hustle culture. They're building empires from their bedrooms. Sound familiar? Actually, this kind of is a fundamentally different approach to business. They're going to change set economic structures and the set way that kind of commercial private sector business occurs. Do you have a kind of counter argument to that?
As someone who's set up a business, I wouldn't be able to do that without a really solid team around me that have skills that I don't, and I'm really ready and willing to learn. And I kind of did set up my business and was from a bedroom and was actually I need a studio, and I couldn't do that on my own. I've really had to reach out and learn and get mentors, and I'm really, really grateful for the knowledge that's been passed down to me. And I do think it's amazing that you can if you want to do something, you can start it, and you have to work really hard, and we're ready to work really hard. But some things I worry about are what happens when the apps that we have used to build a platform no longer exist. Look at what happened to Vine. People RIP. People created their whole career around Vine, and Vine no longer exists. What happens to my friends who run their businesses through Instagram when Instagram's no longer a thing? I don't really know if they're ready for that and what's going to happen. And there was an article about this girl who her Instagram got deleted and she had however many million followers, and she was I'm going to have to start again. This has ruined my life. She was I don't know how to have a 9-to-5 job. She was in tears. She was I'm going to have to be a sex worker. It was wild. But yeah, what happens in the next stage, and when the internet fails us, or our phones stop working, or something completely new comes around the corner and we are not ready for it, because anything's possible, gang.
I think what's also interesting is we were talking about the Independent article about this YouTuber or this Instagrammer. She has about 35k followers, something like that. And she'd been promoting brands, promoting clothing, like fast fashion brands. And then she started her own fashion line and started selling her own T-shirts. And I think she did not make the sales that met her engagement on her social media posts. And it's almost
like 5 T-shirts.
Yeah.
5.
35 followers, 5 T-shirts sold. And I think it's this idea of like real world connections and real engagement, real face-to-face connection and building connections offline as well as online is still very important, and we should still invest in it.
Yeah, and also I think it's amazing that we have so many DIY like businesses and artists. I predominantly work with a lot of DIY artists, and I think that's amazing, and I really, really champion them, and I stick by them, and I want them to stay DIY. But you'll notice a difference in their careers when a bigger company comes along and pumps money into them. Like there is a difference. You see them a lot more. Like Ed Sheeran was like rolling around on SBTV for ages, and then he got signed, and now everyone like knows his voice immediately. And you even know when he's written a song and he's not singing it, you know that's an Ed Sheeran song, because he has the money just like thrown at him, and like he's plastered everywhere.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the two arguments that you've just made about the entrepreneurialism, wow, and your previous argument was that they're both saying that broadly, like this thing about Gen Z changing the world, actually, like the tools of production actually like are tools that belong to other generations, and they're kind of at the mercy of kind of market ebbs and flows, and so that maybe actually it's not necessarily. They're not necessarily true entrepreneurs in the like most in the most like true sense of the word. Jack, I'm sure you have an opinion on this.
Yeah, just a couple. I guess firstly, thinking of like what you're saying about like what happens when these people are like investing everything into like YouTube or Instagram. There's been like a massive increase in these like I think they're called like cross hyphenates or something. So people who are actually doing loads of different hustles, they'll have like their Insta, and then on the side, they've got like a Depop thing where they're trying to make money there, and they might have something completely separate where they're selling merch. Like we're seeing this with like music, like with like these incredible artists who are like coming from like essentially like grassroots type thing, but they're also doing merch at the same time. Like people are really looking to like diversify the way that they're making money. So with that, it's like I think that's this like entrepreneurial spirit coming through, is like rather than actually just hedging all your bets on one thing and then having your account shut down and being like screwed, it's like actually like let's kind of put like fingers in pies, like let's try this and that, and they try all these different things. So I think that's something that's like super exciting about like from Depop perspective, is that we have these like incredible creatives who are like sitting on Depop. They're like selling on Depop, doing a great job, but actually, in many cases, the thing that they're really great at is something else. And the thing that they're really trying to do is, some people use Depop because they actually just want to pay their fees to go and become a doctor. And that's the kind of stuff like we really love, is that just like using a platform to get to where you want to be. So I also think that with the like genuine, I think you kind of like touched on a bit of like authenticity there, is like you could have someone who's like great Instagram following, like promoting fast fashion, but when they switch to their own brand, there's like no kind of like not enough like clout there to basically get it off the ground. I think the people, like the young people we're working with, are kind of really looking within themselves. Like they see their like Instagram or their Depop as like a representation of them. And so when they're selling something, they're not just selling it because they want to make money. They're selling it because, that's part of my aesthetic. That's something that I really like believe in, like that's something I would wear. And so with that, it's like I don't think the danger of going down your own way and then having no followers is really there. Like we've seen a lot of like great sellers on Depop who are really good at curating items, going to like create stuff, and they've done really well. And it's like really exciting for us because that's, I don't know, this is like plug for work, but it's like we're essentially like helping people to get to where they want to be, and that's just like really exciting. It's like you see these people with so much creativity and so much energy and passion, and they need support from other people. Like my role is to support them, and it's like I don't know much about accounting, but if someone comes to me age 14 and says, how do I do my accounts, it's like that's my job, is to work it out. And it's like they definitely need support. It's not going to be an independent thing, but the energy and the passion is like absolutely there.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said maybe for Gen Z, like growing up in the shadow of seeing like being a shift in kind of popular celebrity from like people who were maybe movie stars or sports stars or whatever to people who are actually like the founders of tech empires. It's like today's celebrity is like an Elon Musk and like a Zuckerberg, and that kind of has an impact on what you perceive to be of like cultural value if you're 14 and you want to be like really, really rich.
Yeah. I was just going to say that because particularly young Generation Z see the future is so uncertain, there's this enormous drive to be, as you say, these iconic the next Mark Zuckerberg or the next Elon Musk. So I think there's that incredible motivation, and it's really quite exciting to think about all these kids, you know, who've kind of been raised on technology, who are currently at school or college or university, and what they're creating in their bedrooms. And it's really exciting to see what that will outcome. And I simply don't think that kind of evolution and really, really quick sort of development won't stop. I think it'll actually speed up. So it's really exciting to think, you know, when you think like there was MySpace and that was a big thing, and then it was Facebook, and then it was Instagram, and how quickly they replaced one another. And it's quite thinking, well, what's next? And one day we'll all like laugh at like, you know, the antiquated Instagram.
Yeah, and then I'll be out of a job. So let's
no,
keep our fingers
you'll
crossed
go to the
for
next
that one. Okay, cool. I'm like watching the clock like a hawk. So I think we're now going to open up this panel to you guys to see if you have any kind of challenges to the for or against side, or any challenges to me. Preferably not, but yeah, open to you guys. I think someone's wandering. Beej, the lovely Beej, is wandering around with a DIGI branded microphone. So please open up any. I also have pre-prepared some questions for awkward silences, so I'm happy to ramble on if you need to think. But please do challenge our audiences in the spirit of debate. Yes, yeah, we have one over there. I know. Don't worry, my questions are really facetious.
First of all, thanks so much. That was really interesting to hear from all of you. I think so. This is a two-part question. Do you think we are A, doing our understanding a disservice, and B, possibly hindering progress by putting in a judgment filter on Gen Z? I think something Zoe said was that it's quite blinkered, and yes, it's a more liberal generation, sure, but there are other pockets within society who are Gen Z age, and is it more like an ideological category that you have to identify with? Like, do all Gen Zers think they're Gen Z if it comes with all these different activisms or ways of thinking?
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I think the weight of expectation with any generation sort of can be a bit crushing. And I think if you assign, I mean, it just ends up being a stereotype, doesn't it? Then it's like, which is something that Generation Z are kind of anti. And I think that the important thing is that the understanding with any kind of label that there's multitudes within that label, and you know, and there's kind of many things that you can be and that you can achieve, and if you don't have a big tick next to activist, that doesn't mean you've failed as a Generation Z. So I think that you're absolutely right, and I think the way that you kind of remove that kind of weight of expectation, which is weighty, and I think it's ultimately quite oppressive, is that we open up the label. And it isn't just about being an Instagrammer or an activist, because equally you're fabulous if you go to medical school, or you're a nurse, or you're a painter, or you're a plumber. And I think it's insane that you feel, or young people feel, like they've only succeeded if they've got 50,000 followers. And I think that is one of the biggest drivers of mental health issues with young people. And it's one of the biggest mythologies, really, and this notion that nothing matters unless it's celebrated online. And I think that's really, really important. And that it's absolutely what Jack was saying. This real importance, and this is something I talk about all the time. It's fine to live your life somewhat online, but you have to have a life offline, and that's really important too. So I think that was a brilliant question and a great point.
Yeah, I also want to kind of add to that. I think as a culture, we're kind of like pathologically attuned to the question of like, what's next? What's the like newest animal? And and yeah, the kind of industry that exists around that is like inherently problematic. I think the kind of the labeling and the questioning is it's a result of kind of like capitalism and a need to kind of market more effectively. But I think the kind of the less cynical side of that is that it is a genuinely attempt to kind of optimize and understand the behaviors and mindsets of a new generation in order to like communicate better and to create collaborative projects that have kind of stronger cultural value, or genuinely just to kind of keep in touch with an age group. So I think the right answer to this panel isn't either yes or no to that question, but it's important that we keep questioning, like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing these exercises? Why every week in my inbox are there like 7 new kind of reports telling me what Gen Z want or what they don't want, or why? So yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, go for it. I think have this. We're recording for a podcast, so wait for the sound.
I wonder if there's a different slant on this as well. So I'm Gen X, so I might be the only one in this room.
You're the happiest.
Yeah. Well done. Hello.
Woo, okay.
Hello.
Raise of the Digi Pixel
X's.
fingers for anyone who's a Gen X in the room. Just you guys. Cool. Oh my God, that is a whole other debate. Like
1965 to, I think it's 1979.
Gen X, I think it's 38 to 50, and then beyond that, it's kind of the baby boomers.
Yeah,
so,
65 to 79 is X, and then beyond that is
the years, not the age.
I would like to add that almost every single person who does generational observation disagrees as to where the boundaries lie. And some people, exactly. And some people kind of mark it as to like, where were you when 9/11 happened? Or like, there's a lot of other ways that you can kind of categorize generations. But yeah, sorry, I'm going off topic. Keep going.
That's fine. I think my observation was it's not just generational; it's actually the demographic as well. So I think there's a real skew actually to the behaviour that we're talking here is actually is quite urban people that are. They're very much on trend and they're in a tribe. Actually, if you go outside of London, dare I say, outside the bubble, these behaviours are probably a lot less prevalent. So are they going to change the world, Gen Z? Personally, I think it's technology that's enabling it, and probably Gen Z, a certain part, are accelerating it, thanks to what Millennials put in. That's my...
this feels like
my take
a
on
vote
it.
for the no
There you
side.
go. What do we think?
Go for it, Zoe.
Well, I mean, I'm from Scotland. I don't know if you could tell by the accent already. And I grew up in the Scottish borders in a town called Galashiels, where there was 300 or something, the population. I still live there because I go to uni. So, I mean, I basically still live there 3 months of a year. So, yes, definitely. I was a minority being liberal and having hustles and doing things when I was a teenager. And I grew up with people that were very much into hunting and shooting, and still very much are into hunting and shooting. And when I tell my friends I live in Aberdeen, which is a city, when I tell my friends from home, like, there was like a hunting festival going on at home, they're like, what? That still happens? And I'm like, yep. And there's people my age that are really into it. And there's a lot of them, actually. There's a lot of rural areas, and we don't really, I think, there's this urbanization of culture where, what kids are doing in like cool pockets of the country is amplified because obviously that's where most of them are, but there is still pockets of rural children and children. I just called myself a child. Rural young people that aren't like this sort of niche or social categorization.
Cool. Any other questions? Okay. Wow. The tide has turned.
Can I add just one thing to your point? And this is very much a sort of Gen Z and also millennial thing, that we have the greatest division from a class point of view. This is the most class-divided generation we've ever seen. And what's really worrying about that, to your point and your point, is that we're seeing the lowest class migration of young people that you've ever seen. And by that, I mean working class kids grow up housed with and go to school with working class kids. middle-class kids, and these are really crude labels, grow up, go to school with, and go to school with middle-class kids, and wealthy kids grow up and go to school with, and previous generations, and this is like all data sort of upheld, they would have much more of kind of social mixture groups. But the way kind of London is a terrible example, but sort of cities are organised, is that they're kind of being kept completely separate. And again, I think that's really interesting, that so the Generation Z experience is just so incredibly vastly different depending where you live, both demographically and geographically, far more so than even 10 years ago. So that's just an interesting thing that I think kind of adds to both sides of the argument.
Cool. Was there some questions from the back?
Sorry, I agree with you two over there. I don't think... I think millennials will go down as saving the world, but Gen Z will get the credit for it. In terms of... I don't think there's any more activists now, just like I don't think there's a lot more hustlers, as you call it. Back in the days, you had P. Diddy, you had pirate radio stations. They were doing all that sort of stuff. It just didn't get the exposure. In terms of activists, there were plenty. Like, how many marches did we used to have back in the day? And also, to that gentleman's point, I think millennials created all the technology that now the Gen Zs are using, and that's allowing them to communicate. So we think, oh, Gen Z are amazing and they're going to change the world, but I think millennials will change the world. Just lastly, you mentioned there's a lot more pressure on Gen Z. They have to go to school, they have to get good grades, they have to do this, they have to do that. That's not Gen Z, that's being an Asian.
Amen. Cool. I think there were maybe some more from the back. Yeah, cool.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for everything. I don't really fall on either side of the debate, because I'm not sure. Changing the world, I kind of feel like every generation affects the world, and defining that change as positive or negative is kind of would be a separate conversation. But I wanted to expand on what y'all were talking about with the fact that there's a very loud minority, and that maybe there are certain examples of people. It comes to mind the students who protested after the Florida massacre, and artists like Blueface or whatever, these people sort of get exploded into the national or the international consciousness, but there's a lot of people who aren't being heard of, like what he was saying, outside of the bubble, and that there's all these dichotomies of you're able to expose bullies, but it's also easier to bully. You're able to establish new beauty standards, but then those become their own standards. And there's kind of this flip side of every coin. And I guess the flip side of the big coin to me would be the people we're not hearing from, and the people who see the hustle and the entrepreneurialism as this great thing, but that's not really achievable for the vast majority of the population, and that they're going to end up maybe feeling disillusioned and disenfranchised, and not be able to create beyond a sort of limited time scale maybe. It's just thoughts. I don't really.
Yeah, that's a very, very nuanced point.
Yeah, and I also think if we talk about hustle and activism, what you create online, I think it's great that we're getting these walkouts from schools, protests are being shot into the mainstream, and hustle. We talk about hustle a lot, but Instagram, especially the way you put yourself out there, and the way you build your platform, and the way you build your business, if you're an entrepreneur or an activist and you're young, it's really, you curate it, you show what you want people to see. So I don't know whether, if anything, online's ever really that genuine. I think building Foundation FM, we built the whole studio, we painted it, we did all of that. We don't post that online. We literally popped out of thin air to some people, and they were like, oh wow, there's this really cool new station, but they didn't see the real graph that went behind it. And that can, I guess, people can Instagram themselves being staying up really late, working really hard again, but they could just be in bed, we don't know how much of that's real, or what if, it's all true now, I guess, if that made sense.
What is reality anyway?
What is reality?
Zoe?
Yeah, well, I think I kind of get that. I started doing filmmaking and writing and doing things like that because I enjoyed it. It was my hobby, and it's now become my job. And it's like, well, what do you do for fun? I make films for fun, but I also get paid to make films. I write for fun, but I also get paid to write. And I have noticed that I have profited. There, I got there. Hey, from my hobbies, and it's like, well, it's this like, I think they call it millennial burnout. But it's like, is there going to be a Gen Z burnout? And if so, like, how will that look? Because our hustles are our passions, what we love, but also what we get money from as well.
But also to that gent's point, that I think with generational change, it takes a village. And not everyone can be visible in that change. But if you think about like Bob Dylan or the Beatles or Public Enemy or Rage Against the Machine, or all those, or artists or authors, all those people, they became symbolic of social change, and they instituted social change. But it was and they were visible, but it was the generations that followed them that raised them up. And of course, not all Generation Z can be visible in that change. And not all Generation Z are going to be kind of celebrities or have big followers, but they are so important, all the people acting behind the scenes. And we're not just talking about tech or online or brands. It's the future is about all the people that are contributing and learning and becoming people that will make the world and hopefully make the world better. And I think it's to your point that, you don't have to be famous, and you don't have to be visible, and you don't have to have 1 million followers to create and institute real change. And I think that's a really important message for Generation Z. And I think it's something that, they should be told more of.
I also think that, like, these people are still incredibly young. It's like what you were saying is, like, these guys are still all, like, under the age of 22. So it's quite early to be like, who are there, like, Martin Luther Kings? Like, they're all still under the age of 21. Like, they've still got, like, decades in which they can actually, like, cause that change and actually do those things. Like, a lot of them are still learning, like, how to do this, and they're still trying to discover themselves. And it's like, once you get to that age where you feel more confident and you feel like you've connected with and found your community, that's when the action starts to happen. So it's still really early for these guys to be, like, changing the world. It's more like, what's going to happen in the next, like, 40 years? Like, I don't know how old Mark Zuckerberg was when he founded Facebook, but he was probably, like, well, I guess, terrible example. But it's like a lot of these people that are, like, creating the platforms, like, we've only discovered they're great platforms 5 years, 10 years on, and you can't really expect an 11-year-old, like, if these people wanted to build that, it's like they had to build Facebook when they were 12 in order for us, like, today to realize it. It's like we need to give them a little bit of time before we can look back and be like, what have they actually done? Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I think we've probably got time for, like, one more question. Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
If it's quick too.
Okay, I'll try and be quick.
It's more to these guys.
Okay. Right. So at the beginning of the debate, the question is, will Gen Z change the world? Which I quite confidently raise my hand as in, yes, they probably will. However, I have two things that I wonder in my mind. First of all, we tend to talk about it as if it's going to be an active and deliberate change, which I'm not sure it is. Second, isn't necessarily a positive change, because the way that I see current trends in Gen Z, honestly, I'm slightly worried. Like, I see my younger brother and sister and their habits, their 13-year-old sharing nude photos. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a lot of activism and people are aware, but there's also a lot of bad things going around when really young people have too much access to information.
That is controversial. No, it's good, thanks. Does anyone want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I kind of feel like working with a lot of young people, I feel like a lot of responsibility, especially around social media. So I was saying, this is so weird, I was saying this today. If I was 16 and I was trying to get more followers, like if I was 16 and had 500 followers and my friend had like 5,000, I'd be like, what's wrong with me? And I would post a picture and say I was like a little bit cheeky, and then like got a following. I'd be like, oh, and then you do push the boundaries. And when you're young and you're like, go away, mum, you don't understand, you're hiding stuff, like these things can get out of control, and you don't always know your boundaries, and you don't have all like the right people to talk to. I think there are amazing online resources now, like especially around like sex education, like people like the charity called Brooke that massively deal with sharing pictures and nudes and how to go about that in like a really safe and consensual way. And we are overwhelmed by a lot of like pornographic images now. I think the average age to see a pornographic image at the moment is, I nearly fell off the chair, is like 6.
It's 9 for a boy, 11 for a girl.
That's really young. So I think there is a responsibility in schools, and like myself as a millennial, and that we do have these, I don't want to say monitor, but have these really open conversations. I know sometimes they're really uncomfortable, but I think it's important to have them. And that's where like mentoring, resources, getting sex educators to come into schools, because it's awkward if it's your teacher. You'd be like, oh my God, miss, I don't want to hear about this. You know what I mean? It's important to have people that are professionals, and that we need to have government that are aware of this, are talking about this, making changes around it. I think as schools become academies, which is becoming quite prevalent, they can make their own they can make their own curriculum, and that can be a great thing, but also quite a worrying thing because they're not being monitored. And I think it's something we definitely have to speak up about. And yeah, I always try and have like really open conversations about what people are sharing online and whether it's consensual, if they feel comfortable, and just giving people the right resources. I don't know if that really answered your question, but that's how I'm coping.
Anything to say? So the first point was like Gen Z are going to have may have a negative impact, and that the impact that we've been discussing has broadly been like good. Is there anything you guys wanted to say?
I was just
about that?
I think you make a really good point, and I think one of the things that Generation Z are asking for is safer, better spaces on the internet. It's one of the real, absolutely one of the sort of demands that they really want, where there is less bullying, less abuse, less boobs, less dick pics, and actually better information. And I think one of the it's kind of supply and demand that we might see, and that we're beginning to see actually, is more of a responsible internet and people thinking about creating responsible spaces for young people. So hopefully, I think that the movement in the next 5 years was be less toxicity in alignment with and kind of more positivity.
And then, cool. Do we want to have just that one last question in the back, and then we will have a vote?
Sorry, mine's a very short one. You're talking about Gen Z changing the world, but is there a Gen Z in countries like Zimbabwe or Honduras or Sri Lanka, or is Gen Z a very first world phenomenon?
Yeah, so it's predominantly like Western phenomenon. Like a lot of the stuff we're talking about is stuff that's been kind of canonically put out there by like Western schools of thought. So Chloe, do you want to jump off and talk about kind of diversity?
It's a brilliant question, and yes, the research does tend to be very much in sort of westernized countries, and it's one of the areas of interest actually looking outside those things. And I mean, you've got kind of, the sort of countries where there's access to, and there is massive, there's massive sort of Gen Z culture in kind of Southeast Asia and Korea that are becoming really, really influential. So there is much more of a kind of a communication. But the countries that you mentioned, that actually there's quite limited research, and I think that's really opening up, and obviously countries where you actually can't get into. So for example, I've done some stuff out in Russia and Ukraine recently where there's much more limited internet and access to social media. It's really interesting to see the differences. But generally speaking, I don't think you can completely write up. But I think generational labels do tend to be fairly westernised concepts as it stands at the moment. But hopefully that will sort of change, and there'll be more research in those countries, because it'd be really interesting to see variations.
Okay, cool. I think that's all we've got time for. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have another vote, and we're going to see how opinion has shifted, if it has shifted, and in which direction. So if you could get your Digi Pixel foam finger things at the ready. And if you are voting for the motion that you believe Gen Z will change the world, can you please hold up your hands now? Just going to give them a bit of time. Okay, while she's counting, I'm going to try you out some Gen Z slang. What does yeet mean?
Can I answer?
Yeah.
It's like an exclamation of like happiness, like, oh, you did so, oh, yeet. Like, I don't know, like, oh my God, got it on my exam, yeet.
Okay, well done. You guys, what is a rinster?
That's your, like, it's your real, no, rinse is your real Insta, so it's like the one.
Mm-hmm. And a finster is your...
Like the one.
Okay, cool. Okay, good. Have they all counted? Okay, cool. So then put your hands down, and then if you are against the motion and you believe that Gen Z won't change the world, please raise your hands now. And while those are being counted, what is a soft boy?
Oh, it's like fuck with pretends to be nice.
Nailed it. Okay, and... what does skirt mean? Bad pronunciation. Skirt.
It's like it's like an exclamation thing.
It means literally nothing. That is the right answer. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Is that all voted? Okay. Cool. Do you want to come and? Are you texting me the results of this? Oh my God. Okay. So before we had the vote this evening, 15 of you voted for the motion, and 3 of you voted against the motion. And then after the debate, I need to now unlock my phone. Moment of tension. 16 of you voted for Gen Z, and 5 of you voted against Gen Z. Interesting. Okay, so we've split the vote. Oh my God. Okay, this is awful. This is the first ever Digi debate, and we have a split vote. However, slightly more people have shifted in terms of like proportional representation, to get kind of technical about it. Slightly more people have shifted their opinion towards the against side. So I'm just going to be really brazen and go against the rules of debate and say that this side have carried it. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much. So we have just some drinks next door. We've made you a special Digi Diva cocktail. This is pink, obviously. So please go and enjoy that. And then there's also these voting posters on the wall where you can go and cast your votes on really pressing issues, like whether you're a digi data or whether you're finding love offline, and similar pressing issues. Thank you so much, guys.